Let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it, man. Matt, what's going on, man? Back, technically speaking, episode two.
Episode two. Two of many.
Two of many to come, yeah. Well, cool. I think that today's topic for technically speaking, um, I think it's a pretty interesting one because the people element I think sometimes gets undercovered, or it's a little bit undervalued in terms of what you're evaluating from a tech perspective, in terms of who's actually leading the team, whether it's a CTO, director of product, whoever it might be. What I've noticed about when you're involved in our diligence process is you care very much about leadership qualities. You care about um, what what they're thinking from a vision perspective, how they think about technical debt, which we covered last episode. Anyway, I found it fascinating, having worked at tech startups, understanding how you are viewing the quality of leadership within the engineering side of the business.
Yeah.
And so that's what I wanted to cover this episode is kind of what you think makes a good CTO. How do you build a really strong engineering team? Some of what we covered in prep was like, what are the red flags when you're evaluating, the tech side of a company from an investment perspective, and what are green flags? What are great signals? So that's a little bit of what I think we, want to cover today. Yeah, I mean, do you have anything else that would be relevant in terms of topics of discussion, just setting the stage for our conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that pretty much covers it, right? It's like, from an investor point of view, like what are some important things to look at? Like what are my blind spots? What am I missing? If I'm going at it trying to diligence a company, what questions should I be asking, right? And what do those answers mean? Because I think the questions to ask are one thing, but actually knowing what the answers mean and where to go with that it's a whole nother it's a whole nother another discussion, right? It's actually funny, like people on our team have, because I will occasionally give people my kind of diligence checklist. It's just a checklist of questions I put together, over the years of doing this, and people go like, "What? Like, why are you giving that away? Like, it's it's your secrets." I'm like, "Is it my secrets? Like, you have a piece of paper that has a bunch of questions on it. Like, so what? Like, what? Actually knowing what the answers mean, and even what the questions mean, for that matter, are a little more important, right?" And I'd say also, I think our first episode was really a good intro to the series because we talked about technical debt. Technical debt is a big part of seed diligence for the team. It plays a very vital role in my kind of process when I'm actually interviewing the CTO, the whole team. So I'd say if you weren't in that episode, go listen to it. It's on our website. You can listen to it for free. So go listen to that, maybe after this episode, because I think there's a lot of good nuggets in there that kind of that parlay into this. And then I'll also say my normal disclaimer, like this stuff varies, a seed diligence process versus an A diligence process versus a later stage diligence process versus an M&A process. Like they're all important, but they all vary. And I think most of the things that we're going to be talking about here are going to be very applicable to seed or pre-seed specifically. Yeah. So if you're an A investor and you want help with that, like call me. I'm happy to walk you through it, but like I guess take what we're saying here with kind of a grain of salt.
Yeah.
And I think also, from that perspective, like I kind of come at it from two angles, right? So when I'm diligencing a team, it's like, I guess first and foremost, I'm looking at the hard fought lessons that I learned building a company or building companies, and the things that were important to me then, I found out later maybe weren't so important overall, right? So looking at those things, those kind of hard lessons that I've learned kind of in the trenches, and then also looking at it from the top down, because I used to do a lot of M&A diligence. I still do some. Like I get hired by attorneys and companies looking to acquire other companies who are trying to assess the overall health of a technology organization. But I kind of look at it from that angle too, right? And it's interesting if you think of it like at a seed level, asking those kind of very organizational questions to the founders. Like the questions actually aren't that different, but the things that you look for in the answers are very different, right? The answers mean very different things at very different stages. So like, let me give a somewhat contrived example of that. So when I'm doing either seed or M&A diligence, right, one of the questions I ask is about disaster recovery. So what are your disaster recovery procedures, right? The word disaster recovery is a bit loaded in and of itself. Like 10, 20 years ago, disaster recovery meant a very different thing than it does today, right? We have things like Amazon and whatnot that help us with these things. Like it used to mean like you need to have a process with a backup data center that if an earthquake hits your data center, you can take your physical offsite tape backups of the database and drive to your SunGuard backup data center and like physically load those in and like get the product going, right? Like obviously it doesn't, hopefully it doesn't still mean that. Hopefully no one's still doing that, although I'm sure some people are. You know, so when I'm talking about those things, right, it's like the question in and of itself, you expect the answer at an M&A level to be very in depth, right? You actually expect at a seed level, like I don't want to hear like, oh, I have this, you know, 20-page document describing my disaster recovery procedures. Because if you're doing that at seed level, it's like, why are you doing that, right? Like, there's no reason to do that. But I also don't want to hear crickets. Like, I don't want the answer to be like, what's disaster recovery? Or I've never heard of disaster recovery, or like no answer at all, right? So, you know, I think it's that kind of nuance about the answers that you're getting that are super important, right? And if you're an established company, like what are the problems of not having disaster recovery? Like one, like, I don't know, you have SLA, you know, SLAs are in place with your customer. Like if your product is down, you don't have a plan to get it back up, like you're losing money, you're probably gonna have to refund them money, right? There might be legal ramifications. You might get sued for the product being down. There might be financial ramifications because like your customers, when they figure out how bad you screwed up, like they're all gonna be like, see ya, we can't trust you, we're not your customers anymore, right? These are all like big problems for a later stage company, right? If I'm a pre-revenue startup, like, yeah, maybe I'm running pilots, but I probably don't even have customer data, right? Or if it's a pilot and I lose the customer data, it's like, is that a big deal? Maybe, right? But the simple answer of that, like the answer that they give, like if they have an answer at all, like that actually speaks volumes about the person building the system, right? So it's less about what is the actual procedure, like what do I do? And it's more about, have I thought about this as an engineer, right? Because if they haven't, then it tells me like, A, they're not using modern tools like, you know, Amazon Web Services there, where if you use, you know, something like RDS, your database backups are built in, it's automatically redundant. You literally check a box on the screen and it's automatically redundant between two data centers. It'll fail over automatically if one data center goes down, all that good stuff, right? So it tells me that you're not aware of those tools. Or it tells me that you probably haven't been on a startup product team getting any kind of scale, because like, I can assure you from personal experience, like if you're responsible for, you know, let's say like introducing a bug that starts deleting customer data, like you only need to have one of those oh shit moments where that was your problem to like never want to have that happen to you ever again, right? Like there's like nothing, like as an engineer, there's nothing worse than that moment, right? So it tells you probably haven't been through that, right? And then it also tells me like, as a leader, as a technical leader on the team, like, am I capable of leading the technology organization forward post the seed round? Like probably not, right? Can I get us through the seed round? Can I build an initial product? Yeah, maybe. I don't think the answer in and of itself tells that. But am I the right person moving past the seed round for the growth phase of the company? Probably not, right? So I guess that was a really long explanation of describing like how it's not necessarily the questions that we're asking, but it's the answers and the insights that you glean from the answers, and less of a check the box thing and more of a process of finding out information through kind of normal day-to-day questions that people should be thinking about.
Right. So I mean, in a lot of ways, you know, the way I hear that is, you know, a typical interview, you're not, I mean, the actual like literal answers that someone gives you in an interview they matter, but it's not, you know, what you're really searching for is red flags and also green flags, right? And so to your example, if someone's not being thoughtful about disaster recovery, that's an immediate red flag because it points to so many other aspects of their thinking, right?
Yeah, right, right.
And, and,
And
and
and it's like why? Like, so tell me why, right? Like, okay, you don't know what RDS is and you're not using the automated features. Like, why not? You know, it's not like I'm not trying to be like an asshole. I'm not trying to be, pick a fight. But it's like why? And maybe there's a good reason. Like, oh well, we tried to use RDS, but it was so expensive and we didn't have any money, and like our credit card was about to get shut off, and so like we had to kind of scale it down and put it on an EC2 instance because it was cheap and fast. It's like, okay, right? Like that's an acceptable answer. But at least you know and you can articulate that, right? But if you can't articulate it at all, or I don't even know what that is, like that's a whole nother story. But like you said, it's about red flags and green flags and digging into those and actually understanding the kind of underlying
sure,
reasoning.
the question behind the question, the answer behind
Right.
it. Yeah.
Right.
Well, cool. Well, let's jump into this a little bit. So you mentioned your background, and I think it would be helpful to kind of share a little bit about some of your engineering experience before we before we dig into exactly like what your process is. I think it's just helpful because like it's what you said. You learned what you learned through your experiences of trial and error, through failure, etc. What were some of those experiences, and how do they relate to how you view the world and how you proceed in a diligence process?
Yeah, for sure. So, I kind of started my career at a venture-backed startup. I came in as a fairly early employee. I wasn't super early, but early enough that I kind of got to see it through some growth phases, right? Which was super interesting. I started my first startup, after that, and I really struggled. Again, this goes back to our technical debt conversation, but that was one of the things that I struggled the most at my first startup was taking into account what is the appropriate level of technical debt, right? Coming off of this startup that when I left the first company that I worked at, they had just sold for like 60 million. So a decently successful exit. It wasn't the best thing in the world, but like the investors made money, right? Let's put it that way. So decently successful, right? But we were in a growth phase, right? So the things that we were focused on at that startup, I quit. Literally went to work at, I talked to my co-founders and I quit one day. I went to work, the next day at my new venture. And it was like, I was trying to apply the things that we had been doing at the venture-backed startup that had just sold to this new company where it was literally just me building product. Like I was the only one by far who knew anything about technology, about writing code and building product, right? And like it took me a while. It took me a surprising long time to figure out those nuances of like the things that we were doing on this large team with a lot of extra money don't translate to building a first product, right? So I think that's super important. I also kind of had the luxury. So I ran a dev shop, in Atlanta for about 8 years. And I had the luxury of being able to build or be responsible for the initial build out of a lot of products without having the kind of financial responsibility of being a co-founder of those products. We were getting paid to build them, right? And we'll probably dig in more on this later because I have strong opinions about dev shops. But yeah, I think the same concept applies, right? Like I've seen even my team make a lot of mistakes during those initial build outs, especially around technical debt, right? So like it is so, very core to kind of the diligence process that I go through in evaluating a seed company. And I think to that extent, if we're talking about, engineering teams and things that engineering teams do well and things that engineering teams don't do well, like I think engineering teams are really good at two things. One, if you're a startup in our incubator, you've heard me say those many times. One, they're good at overcomplicating everything. And two, they're good at not being able to provide accurate estimates of their work, right? And I think two kind of comes from one a little bit, right? So it's super important, and I've seen this like with my team, with other teams, like I've just seen it happen so many times, right? It's so important for the team as a whole to have this understanding of technical debt and to really embrace it and understand what it means, right? And understand what it means to work through that. and understand when it's okay to have technical debt and when it's not okay to have technical, and which kinds of technical debt are okay and which kinds aren't. And it's like, it's also, this is probably the largest point of contention between, engineering and leadership, or between a technical co-founder and a non-technical co-founder, right? It's that battle of like, no, we can't do this. Like, I'm an engineer and I'm telling you, this is not the right way to build this product. Like, I don't care if it takes a year longer. Like, we can't build it this way, right? It's that battle of like, who is right and who wins, and I think I've kind of reflecting on my career, like, and kind of being in the position that I am now, where I'm suddenly like evaluating all of these teams for investment. It's kind of interesting to look back on my career and find those points. Like, I can see it almost every time I talk to a team about that we're diligencing, like I can like relate it back to a time in my career, right? Where it's like, yeah, I've seen this story play out before, right? Like, I remember when this happened. So I think it's like part of it is just that it's that experience of like having been through it and having seen a lot of issues and had to work through challenges. It's I think super beneficial.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. I think it's helpful to hear your background, to kind of understand how you have built your process for the diligence, for diligencing specific, teams specifically related to, technology and engineering, which is our topic today. I think like we'll probably cover in this series. We'll probably like branch off the different topics of conversation, but we do want to stay somewhat focused today on the team, right? So
right. Yeah, if you don't watch me, I'll get into technical debt and talk about it all day long.
Yeah.
Again, even though we already did that.
I think given the length of last month's episode, I think we're all aware.
Right.
So, all right. So you're looking at an investment and you set up a diligence call. Maybe the CTO is involved. The chief product guy's involved. Walk us through your process. Like, what are the core tenets of what you look for? Just at a high level, we'll dig into specifics in terms of questions later. But like, what are you looking for? What are you bringing? What are you coming to that conversation with from a checklist perspective?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, first and foremost, like you say, like maybe the CTO is involved, like that is the first check. Like, is the CTO involved in the diligence process? And like, I laugh because it sounds funny to me, but like it actually has happened. It's like, our CTO can't make a call with you. I'm like, I'm sorry, your CTO can't make a diligence call for me, the CTO of the person diligencing you, to like figure that out. Like, wow, that's not a red flag at all, right?
Well, boy, that happens a lot.
It does. It actually is surprising, and especially because, like, I think sometimes it's the stage of company we're dealing with. Like, they're not full time. Maybe they're trying to be a little sneaky about it. Like, maybe they said, oh yeah, they're full time, and they really aren't. I don't know. Maybe not, right? But I do think it's just the business person, the kind of non-technical co-founder, is trying to protect their time, right? But like for me, that's really a non-starter. So that's like check number one. Like, if we can't get the CTO on the phone, like I have nothing else to say to you, right? So there's that. Once we go into there, it's like I kind of split things up, and I think this is a fairly common way to go about things. But I split things up into three kind of buckets, right? So it's technology leadership, people leadership, and process leadership. Technology being like, can you write code? Like, can you help other people write code? And like, can you build the right thing from a technical perspective? Depending on the startup, like this can maybe surprisingly be the least important thing to me. Because, are you the most like whiz bang smart PhD software engineer in the world? Like, isn't that important to me at a seed stage company, unless the tech that you're building requires that, right? But for, let's say, 90% of things that we see, like they're not that technically involved, right? So there's that. People is, what you would think of, like, can you lead a team of people? Can you build a culture? Do you have experience doing that? Is that something that you want to do? Because a lot of times as engineers, especially kind of technical co-founders, like we want to build like cool shit. Like I don't really want to, I don't want to spend my time managing a team of people and like, or it like sounds good, but then you start digging in and it's like, oh gosh, like I have to deal with like HR issues and like, all the stuff that comes with like the fun things that come with managing people, right? And a lot of times it's just not something that we want to do, and that's okay, right? But I want to know that now. If I'm diligent to you for seed, like I need to know that up front. I don't want to get blindsided when you go to raise your A round and the investors are talking to the CTO and they're like, look, dude, this guy just isn't, he's not going to cut the mustard like moving forward to scale this team. I need to know that now, right? We need to like head that off earlier rather than getting blindsided with it at the A round. So looking for things like that. And then third is process. This again is like not necessary. This is where like our disaster recovery example falls into play. Like it's not necessarily something that I care about. Like if a seed stage startup doesn't have like very rigid processes, like I'd almost say that's a good thing. But are you capable of thinking about those processes? And like tell me what kind of processes based on what you built so far, like what would be good, right? And like what's working for you now, what's not working for you. That can be technical processes like deployment. Like, do you have CI/CD built? Do you have a one-click deployment to production? Are you able to release things quickly and iterate? Or do you have to stay up, you have to wait until midnight and stay up for 3 hours trying to, debug a deployment every time that you want to do that, right? Which is something that's going to really hinder you from, building quickly and iterating quickly enough to build that product market fit. So I'd say those are the three buckets, and then questions kind of branch off from there. And as I go, it's like, it's like, tell me like, which one do you think you're strongest in? And if they say that people leadership is where they're least strong, like I generally will kind of take that at face value and focus more on the other ones, right? Because like I said, at seed stage, like it's not about like, can you do everything perfectly? It's about like, what can you do? What do you want to do? Where do you need help? If we invest, like, am I going to have, like, which of those areas am I going to have to spend time with you? And is that something that I feel like I can do with you? Do I like you? Are you capable of working with me in that manner? Yeah, those kinds of things, right? So it's I'd say not dissimilar to a job interview in many ways. And a lot of it is getting a good feeling on the person.
Yeah. So if from what I just heard, if I'm a technical founder or I'm the CTO at a company that you're diligencing, my goal would be to show thoughtfulness around those three categories. Not, even if I don't have the technical capability, which I don't, even if I don't have the, desire to manage people at a broad level, and even if I don't have the processes in place now, if I'm thoughtful about how I want to build processes in the future, if I'm thoughtful about my role, how it evolves, if I want to build, that's totally cool, but my role is going to stay as an engineer and not, a product leader. And then, if I'm not super competent in terms of the technology, I know I need to go out and hire more competent senior engineers. So
yeah.
if I shoot straight down the middle with you, where do you land from a scorecard perspective on diligence?
Yeah, I don't know that it's about scorecard, right? It's about, I mean, look, like you're a seed company, you've been building for what, 6 months, right? Like not a lot of time. The people that are in place in a seed company may not be the right people that should be in place in 6 months or a year from now. Like that's totally okay, right? So, I also don't think it's realistic for me to say, like, hey Nick, like I like you. Let's say you're a startup and I'm diligencing you. Like, hey Nick, you're a non-technical co-founder. I really like you. I really like your company. Not so sure about the CTO. Like, you're gonna have to go find a new CTO before we invest. Like, that's not really realistic,
Mm-hmm.
Like, in all honesty, that's probably just not gonna happen. Like, I should just say no to you, right? Like, we're not gonna invest, like, because you're not gonna be able to go find you're not gonna magically find a new CTO, with a small seed investment, right? We're talking about down the road, like look for the right person at the A round. That's like a whole different story, right? So I don't know that it's so much about, scoring them and saying like, if you get, above a 50%, like you have my seal of approval. It's more like can you take the money that you're getting at seed can you apply that smartly and build smartly with it? And then, can I work with you? Can you develop enough to get you to that next round, right? And then we'll look at, maybe replacing you, or maybe, bolstering your weaknesses with somebody. Like if you're really good at people leadership, like maybe we need to bring in a VP of engineering to help you with the technical side, right? But yeah, it's more of just understanding those things up front. Like I think for us, especially at Shadow, like the thing that we look for the most, like revenue traction beats all, right? Like if you can demonstrate to me that you have good revenue, that you have product market fit, that your customers like you, they're expanding use of the product, you got good NPS, like all that stuff, right? Like if you can demonstrate that to me, I'm even as a CTO in charge of technical diligence, I don't know, like it takes a lower level for me, right? Because like you're doing the right things from a business perspective. If we need to bolster things on the engineering team, if we need to even, rethink some pieces of the technology, like that's all expected. Like that's the growing pains of building a company. So that's okay, right? So it's like, don't try to bullshit me in the diligence process, right? Like shoot straight, like let's figure out what the strengths are, what the weaknesses are, and like we'll figure it out. Like we'll move forward as a team, us as the investors included, right? We'll move forward as a team and figure all that stuff out. So it's more, so I'd say it's more of really being able to see through the BS a little bit, right? Because sometimes people are really good at answering your questions, even if they don't know what they're talking about, right? So it's that kind of capability of seeing through that to see to the next level, which I think we talked about a little bit earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. Okay, so TPP.
Yeah.
Technology, people, processes. Let's discuss. Let's actually start with the people part, because I think this is if there's anything I've learned from you so far, it's like you care heavily about who's in the current seat, from a leadership perspective on the tech side, and you're constantly thinking long term about capability of the current team to go out and build a product that they're promising, right?
Yeah.
So first of all, how do you look at the difference between an engineer and a CTO? Obviously, an engineer is someone who's, who wants to build, is building, is in the weeds, actually writing code every day. CTO is probably not. But beyond that, like how do you characterize the difference?
Yeah, that's a good question. So at seed, right? I would say, so here's how I define it. At seed, and we're talking strictly at seed. I'm not talking about like the CTO of Yahoo, or that's a bad example. The CTO of Google, like I don't care about those people, right? At seed, an engineer is someone who builds you the most complete engineering solution with the product requirements, the business requirements that you tell them to build for. That's an engineer, right? At seed, a CTO is someone who figures out those product requirements with you and hopefully the customer if you're doing it right? So they figure out what the product requirements are to build, what's the best way to architect and build those business requirements. That's how I define a CTO, right? Now I'm going to throw like a third bucket in there. A CTO / co-founder, or let's just call him a technical co-founder, right? Does all of that other stuff. So they say, what do we need to build? What are the business requirements to build to? And most importantly, what is the fastest and most cost-effective way to get us to build those requirements with the resources that we currently have, right? And I think that's a really important nuance, because when people come to me, I literally had this conversation yesterday. When people come to me and they're like, we need to hire a CTO. We're building we're a product company. I'm a non-technical co-founder. I have a great business idea. I need a CTO to build it, right? What would you put in the job requirement? I'm like, okay, well, here's what I wouldn't put in the job requirement: a CTO, right? Like you actually don't need to go hire a CTO. Like if you go hire somebody who's been a CTO for 20 years, like, is that really the right person to lead the initial product build for your product? And then like, I don't know, 9 out of 10 times the answer is probably no, unless you have a shitload of money, right? Because I mean, first of all, you're gonna have to pay that person, I don't know, $250,000, $300,000 a year, right? So that's a non-starter in and of itself. Like if you can figure that out, like, and that can be figured out, right? but if you figure that out, like, are they actually going to be able to build for you, right? Like, is that going to be the most cost effective way to get you to build that initial product, right? And the answer is almost always no. Like, you need someone who's smart from an engineering perspective, but they know the nuances of building so that you don't run out of money. Like, and I think that's just a really, really
That's a
important
subtle
point.
difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, let's go deep on that for a second. So the difference between a CTO and a technical co-founder, the co-founder must consider the resources at hand, and traditional CTO who you would find in a growth stage company or even a public company is going to be someone who just is constantly thinking about how to architect the best product
I
without.
mean, I think in a way, right? Like, I think that might be pushing it a little too far, because like at a growth stage company, like, look, the CTO has to think about budget too, right? They don't just have unlimited budget, unless they work at a really big company. But generally speaking, they have to also think about monetary constraints. But the difference is, with a seed stage company, the technical co-founder, they have to think about, we have 3 months of runway and we will die. Like, it's not like we'll have to lay people off. It's like our company will be dead. Like, if we don't figure this out in the runway that we have, the company will be dead, and that's the bottom line, right? So fancy engineering solutions and whatever, and doing all these things from an engineering perspective aren't going to get you very far if your company isn't alive, because you have no customers, right?
So am I thinking about this the right way, that if I'm looking for a technical co-founder for my unicorn business idea, the hire I want to make is not the best, the most technically capable person. The hire I want to make is someone with really sound business sense, who also can build if they need to, and they're also a great leader and can hire a team. Like,
Yeah.
it seems what you're saying is the skill of being resourceful with the capital and the runway that you have, that comes from having a really strong business acumen.
Yeah, it's a nuance, right? And like, doing that at a large company is much different than doing it when you're the only person. Because look, like, if I go hire a CTO, I got a unicorn business idea and I go hire a CTO, like, and let's just say I pay them a moderate salary, 150 a year, right? If they're not building anything, like, okay, I hired a CTO, but they can't build for me. Well, the clock's ticking. Like, I'm every minute. Like, you think of it that way. Every minute that they're my CTO, I'm literally paying them, right? But if they're not building, it's like, oh, how long does it take to hire a team, right? And that's not easy. Like, you're not just going out on the street and picking up, software engineers and like, come join, like, it takes months to find them, months, more months to interview them than months for them to transition out of their current job. Like, there's no, in the market, in the current, state of hiring in the market that we are with software engineers, like, if you don't have a job, like, you're probably not very good, like, just to be honest, right? Unless there was some, weird circumstance, layoffs or whatever, right? But I mean, just generally speaking, like, good software engineers are not unemployed. So it takes a lot of time and expense to find them, to convince them to join a pre-revenue startup with a very small runway and leave their cushy job. Like, it's kind of weird because I always bring this up, like, software engineers, they're paid well, but they're not paid that well, right? Like, they're not independently wealthy. They're probably not just going to be able to just quit their job and work for a couple months at a pre-revenue startup without making any money, right? So, like, there's a lot of challenges with that. But I do think it's really important to make that distinction, because it's like, it's like the title of the book is, you hired a CTO, now what? Right? Like, you have to build. Like, the name of the game at seed is building. It's literally, in my opinion, it's nothing but building. Like, if you're not building at seed, you're probably not doing it right. And just going and hiring a CTO that can't build, like, it's not gonna get you to build.
So if that's the case, if the name of the game at seed is building, which I agree, obviously, you're trying to get product out, you're iterating product based on customer feedback, et cetera, then why is the people aspect and the leadership aspect so crucial for you in terms of the vision of the team? Like in some cases, can't you get by with an engineer who's probably not going to be a great leader if they're just a great builder?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's okay. That's 100% okay. Like, you're a good engineer. Like, I'm evaluating you for seed. Like, I think you can build a product. I think once we get to A round, like, we're gonna have to have a conversation, right? Or we're gonna have to have a conversation before that, right? The person that's in charge today may not be the right person to be in charge, in a year. And that, like, that's okay. That's 100% okay. And I try, as people come and they're like, I had a conversation the other day and it was like, the intentions of it were basically like, what do you want to see? Like when we go through diligence, like what are the right answers, right? And there are no right answers. The answers are like, where are you? And can I figure out, can you be honest with me? And can we have an honest conversation about where you are and what you need? And what does that mean? Like if you're only raising 250K and the person that's building isn't the right person to build long term, and you're going to have to replace them, and there's going to be a transition, like, are you going to actually be able to execute with that money, right? Like that's what's super important to me, is like knowing that you're going to be able to take the money that you're raising and actually execute on your milestones and get you to your next round or get you to profitability or whatever it is, right? So it's less about, are you the right person long term? In 10 years, are you going to be the CTO of this company? Like, I don't really care, like if you are, it's great. But like, I just have a much, at Seed, I have a much shorter term view, because you got to get your product built and get some customers and get product market fit before we have to worry about any of that. Right. And you have to do that with the resources that you have at the current time.
Sure. Okay. So we know your process, we know, technology, people, process is kind of those are the three buckets you're looking at. So I'm an investor who isn't you, and I don't have years of experience working within engineering teams and running them. What are my blind spots in those buckets? Like, what am I going to miss from a surface level perspective if I don't have that experience?
Yeah, so I think one thing, and it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, right? Like, getting credential blinded is something that we see a lot. And I try very hard to not get credential blinded. And what I mean by that is, so here's an example. So we just put a term sheet out to a company that one of their key engineers worked at Apple. So he was a data science engineer, like geospatial engineer at Apple. This company actually happens to do a lot of geospatial work. They deal a lot with big data and geospatial data, GIS data, right? So like that's, it seemingly is a great fit. It's like, oh wow, like the guy worked at Apple, right? So you might look at that and say, like, that's amazing. Like this person worked at Apple, like holy shit. And he worked
Google. Yeah.
Right. And he worked, kind of in the direct product, line that is beneficial to our business as well. So like, those are all great things, right? So what does that tell me? Like, it tells me that that person is probably a pretty good software engineer. It's not guaranteed, right? But I think we can generally trust that companies like Google and Apple and Facebook, they have very rigorous hiring standards, and they hire people who can actually produce, right? Like I think we can, it's not guaranteed, but we can pretty much say, yeah, yes, that's a fact, right? We can say also that, this guy, he worked in the maps department at Apple, so we're doing geospatial data. Like he has niche expertise in a technology that we're working in, right? So like, that's also at a surface level, that's also a very good thing, right? So check number 2. The third thing it tells me is that the guy worked at fucking Apple, and pardon my French, right? But like, Apple has $1 trillion market cap, right? And they have basically infinite money to spend on an engineering team. They have basically infinite money to spend on engineering resources. Also, you get to work with like, in a small team of, let's say, 10 to 15 engineers who are like brilliant, probably some of the best people in the country, right, to work with, and solve a problem, right? Like, what does that not tell me? It doesn't tell me that you can come work at a seed stage startup and execute with a 3-month runway, with the possibility of failure is close to 100%, right? If you look at overall failure rates for seed startups, right? And by the way, like that like great engineering culture at Apple, where like everything is like perfection driven, and everything is like well thought out, and we have meetings on meetings to talk about how we're going to plan the product, right? Like that shit's all out the door. Like none of that applies at Seed, like zero. In fact, none of it applies today, but like really none of it applies at Seed. Like it's literally like you and another person sitting in a room talking to a customer and trying to figure out what to build, right? So like all of these like very process oriented and very, you know, kind of, I'll call them cushy things that happen at Apple to make your job easier, like you don't have those here, right? So the fact that you work at Apple actually tells me nothing about the amount of success that you're going to have helping the company execute from a business perspective, right? So I think it's really, like really important, really important to not get credential blinded. And in fact, in many ways, I think that having those credential, like it may be bad. I don't know. I mean, I certainly wouldn't say don't fund a company that just because they have an Apple engineer, right? But like you really have to look at that. And you really have to understand, like, are they going to be able to execute on the things that they need to execute on with the resources that they have? And it's just because they worked at Apple is by no means a guarantee that that's going to happen.
Well, I think one of the key risks there I see is the risk, and you hit on this, is like there's a level, the culture that they're used to and the level of perfection that they're used to. I mean, there's going to be a lot of frustration with processes, speed, you know, constraint of resources. Like they obviously know what they're signing up for. You know, when you transition from Apple to a startup, like
Maybe.
there's some level of understanding, but I don't think the depth of that understanding is usually understood until you get there. And having worked with like a couple early stage startups, there's only one way to know.
Right. Well, like to your point, it's the understanding of like, ooh, cool, a startup, right? Like this is going to be fun. Like I go build, like, ooh, like forget Apple and all the BS that we have to do at Apple. Like this is going to be fun, right? Yeah, no, like that's not how it is. That's not how it is. Like building startups is one of the most like painful and like draining and just, I mean, it's hard. Like shit's hard, right? So yeah, so I think to your point, like that understanding is there's very much a mismatch in expectations, right? And I interview, so like for some of our incubator companies, they asked me to interview, you know, candidates for their technical kind of technical lead positions, right? If they're trying to hire those person. And a lot of time I talk to people who have worked at big companies, and that understanding it's blatantly missing. And I'm like, let me be very clear with you. Like the attitude that you're going to have towards this is not going to be like, how do I go out and build the most, you know, amazing engineering solution? And like, I'm working in a startup to work on quote unquote hard problems, right? Like that can't be the attitude. For 90% of the startups, that's the wrong attitude, right? It's about how do we build with the runway that we have, with the resources that we currently have, to get enough traction to get us to the next level, right? It has to be incremental, unless you can go out and raise a bunch of money. Like if you can go out and raise a, you know, $5-10 million series seed round, by all means, like take your time on that, right? But just for the majority of companies, like that's just not the case, right?
Okay, so let's talk specifics here. So specific red flags that you see in the tech diligence process. What, you know, I'm an investor. What do I need to be aware of from you know, immediate, like when you know, you discover something, or there's, you know, throughout the conversation you hear something that might be a little suspect, you know, just like what are the red flags that when you see it immediately, you're like, this is probably a no-go, or I need to dig very deep and understand exactly what's going on here?
Yeah, so I think one is, and kind of as we touched on, I feel a little like a broken record, but the technical debt issue, right? Like if the technical co-founder or CTO or whoever it is, they don't understand what technical debt is and why it's good in some cases and when it's appropriate to pay that off, like that's just a huge red flag, because it tells me that they're going to be too rigid in their kind of approach to engineering, right? And the engineering approach has to be centered around customer needs and customer expectations, and not about building a product with no technical debt, right? So you know, that's certainly a red flag. I think so. There's this term you've probably heard describing smart engineers who are incapable of working with others, brilliant assholes, right? I can't remember. I'm trying to think who coined that. It was, I don't know, Steve Jobs or somebody. Probably not Steve Jobs because he was kind of one, but you know, like that person, right? Like that's a red flag. Like if you can't have a civil conversation with me in a diligence process, which we laugh, but like that shit happens. Like if we can't get through that conversation without like us kind of, you know, butting heads, like there's no way you're going to be able to lead a
Yeah.
team, right? Or even to work with a customer, or hell, even work with your non-technical co-founder, right? So those kinds of personality issues, which are rampant in engineering, like rampant, are kind of a red flag. I think also it almost sounds unintuitive, but like the smarter the smarter and better of an engineer you are, can sometimes be questionable to me, right? Because like, oh, I'm like a great PhD, you know, and I come up with this, you know, crazy technology, and like that's all great. I love all of that. But when you're talking about then taking that and productizing it and taking it to market, I see a lot of pathways for those types of people to fail doing that. So I think that's important. I wouldn't call that a red flag, right? But I think that's something that if it's a team of PhDs, if there's like a team of 3 PhDs solely responsible for, you know, engineering, like there's probably going to be issues, you know, getting it to market, and kind of working in that customer focused mindset. So those are a few things. I think also having a dev shop lead your,
That's where I was going next.
yeah, having a dev shop lead your product build is a definite red flag. And then like trying to pass them off as your team is a even bigger red flag. Because it's like, oh yeah, like my CTO, like he actually runs a dev shop too, but he's my CTO. It's like, don't try to do that to me, right? Like be honest with what the situation is. If you can't be honest with me in the diligence process, like this is not going to be a good relationship. But I think that's a big thing, right? Like having in-house people that are dedicated to building your product is important.
Yeah, like that. I think one of the things I find interesting about your job as, you know, as leading, you know, one of your roles is leading technical diligence is like, as an investor, you have to somewhat be a pessimist, and you have to be a little bit cynical about, you know, just like your worldview when you're talking to startups. I think it's the founder's job to always be a rational optimist. And then, you know, I think, you know, from an investment perspective, you're kind of like always bouncing around. You start being, you know, you're a pessimist at first, and then you're bouncing around as you meet teams you like, and you become an optimist, but you're constantly bouncing back and forth between being a pessimist and looking at the risks, and then looking at the, you know, at the positive side as well. So, when you do see green flags, when you do get optimistic, what are some of those traits? What do you like kind of jump out of your chair or get excited about when you're interviewing tech founders?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could probably take my negative list and reverse it. Like, you know, if there's a tech founder that that understands technical debt, and not just understands it, there's a nuance between being able to say like, yeah, I understand technical debt, but actually demonstrating the decisions that you've made so far during your product build, that you've taken that into consideration. Like I think as a whole, that's like a whole nother thing, right? Because anyone can study technical debt, but if you haven't actually proactively, if you can't articulate the decisions that you've made so far, and with any product build, there's got to be something, right? If you've been building for 2 days, there's already something, I can assure you, right? So like if you can't articulate what those are to me, like that's a problem. So I think when I find someone who can articulate that, and then can also articulate, you know, like why that's beneficial to them, and then what the plan is, like if they can articulate when they would think about paying that off, you know, I think that's a really good thing for me to see. You know, beyond that, I think, I mean, like I said, there's not like one thing, right? So it's just getting that overall, you know, good feeling that they're going to be able to, you know, they're going to be able to ask for help when they need it. That's hard for engineers to do a lot. And if it's like, look, I don't have a ton of experience managing people, and like I admit that, and I'm not even sure if that's something I want to do, right? Like if they can be honest with me in like our first few conversations about that, and then that's a great sign to me, right? Like that honesty, it just tells me like I'm your investor. I'm hopefully going to be your investor. Like I need to know all the stuff up front, right? The more I know up front, the more I can help you. So the more I get that vibe of being honest and wanting me to help and wanting to lend my expertise, where I can, like, I think that's huge. That's
Yeah,
huge.
yeah. So the honesty aspect, I think, is a good point to touch on. So just to walk everyone through a specific example, the deal that we have under term sheet that you spoke about earlier. I know you all had a pretty honest and transparent conversation with their current CTO. Um, do you mind just sharing kind of some of the details on like what was uncovered in that conversation and what that back and forth was like?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was like, it's funny. I always start the diligence conversations and like, I don't know if this is just me and I'm making this up, but I feel like people never, like they never start out kind of divulging the amount of information that I want, right? And you have to start like prying things out. Like, oh, you want to know about that? It's like, yeah, I want to know about that. Like, I want you to tell me about the code. Like, let's talk about it, right? Like, let's get into the details. So, I in that situation, it was like, we started talking and getting through it. And it was like, he's like, oh, we wrote, this and so and a certain, I won't mention what it is, but a certain kind of programming language, right? It's super old school. Like, it's going to be super hard to hire for. And they've already come into the situation, right? And so we started talking about it, and it's like, oh yeah, like I bet that's fun to hire for. And he's like, oh man, let me tell you, right? Like, we've already had this issue, right? We're already talking about like, should we spend the time now to rebuild this and replace this code with something more modern and something easier to maintain and easier to to hire for and all this stuff, right? And it was just that kind of good conversation, where it was like he wasn't trying to hide it from me. He was upfront about it in the first place, like, yeah, we built this and so, right? Like, so he was upfront about that with me, and he knew. He was kind of like, I hesitate to even say this, but like, this is built in this language, right? And it's like, that's the kind of, it's like, yeah, you should be hesitant about that, but like, thank you for actually telling me, right? And thank you for being honest with me, because like, now we can have an actual conversation with it, and I can give you my advice. Like, maybe I don't think you should rebuild that right now. Like, maybe you should wait to do that, or maybe I totally think you should rebuild it right now, right? But if you're not honest with me about it, I can't actually help you.
Yeah, yeah, it makes a ton of sense. Cool. All right. Well, we got about 5 minutes left. Um, so yeah, I think like last thing I wanted to cover is related to the space that we invest in. And I think regardless, like, so I think probably everyone who's on this call understands, like, we invest specifically in real estate and construction tech. So what we call the built environment, the built world. There's some specific nuances to technical aspects of diligence within our space. Probably applies to a lot of other industries too, but wanted to really call out and get your opinion on some of the factors that do affect what we look for in our space. And the biggest issue, just transparently, is there's a lack of technical talent. There's, we're a pretty nascent market from a tech perspective. So if you like are thinking about recruiting the best technical talent in the world coming out of university, or coming out of competing with the Googles and the Apples of the world, we don't compete very well. And that affects what you look for and how you go out and build and architect a solution. So I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it does. And it's, I mean, it's hard enough competing as a startup, right? Like, just generally speaking, for talent. It's hard to hire. It's hard to convince people to come, work at your pre-revenue startup, or even your early stage startup that's venture funded. Like, there's a lot of risk there, right? There's a lot of unknown, and there's a kind of a missing. I don't know. I guess startups are kind of sexy, but like, if you're talking about like going to work at Google, like that's really sexy, right? And like, going to work at a construction tech startup, is that sexy? Like, probably not, right? You're gonna have to explain to your friends like what AEC is, right? And then like, et cetera, right? So I think there's a lot of just kind of general,
Yeah.
non-sexiness that comes along with working at a startup in the industry. And I also think that as a whole, I mean, the industry, I mean, we're the last or the second to last in R&D spend. So the numbers are just completely dismal, right? So it's an industry that has a reputation of not being forward thinking, right? And that does not attract, like, that's a problem. It does not attract, it doesn't attract that kind of talent to the space, right? I don't want to go work in an industry where people are still filling out triplicate forms and faxing them. I mean, that shit is still happening. That's still happening today, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to go work in that industry. Like, or is like, you know, to convince somebody that the industry is ready for a transformative change with a startup. Like, are they? I don't know. They're currently faxing the form around, right? On it from a triplicate. Like, are they really ready for this transformative change that we're doing? So I think there's just there's a lot of hurdles that you have to kind of get over to convince people of that. So I think that's one thing. And then yeah, it leads to a technical challenge, a technical shortage, because the people who are in the industry, like if you're outside of construction, like how do you know the problems that are in construction, right? So the people that we see, at least coming to us, are people who are industry insiders who have seen an inefficiency or they've seen some kind of problem, you know, kind of in the space. And they don't know how to execute on that technically, right? They're not capable of writing software, or maybe they're technical-ish. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, engineers in construction, right? But they're not like software engineer, right? They don't necessarily want to do that, or they don't feel comfortable doing it. So there's a lack of people to actually execute on those ideas technically, and I think, I think it just compounds all the issues, and that's a huge problem. Yeah.
Matt, we're getting the plug pulled on us. There's another webinar starting right now, so I'm going to cut this conversation short. I think there's a lot of topics we addressed today that would be great for next time. So we'll make sure to get there. But yeah, thanks everyone for attending, and Matt, thanks for your thoughts.
Of course. Thanks, everybody.
All right, cheers.
See ya.